So good afternoon. My name is Pam Strickland. I'm the founder of North Carolina Stop Human Trafficking, and I will be leading us through Human Trafficking 201 today. Thank you so much for being here. Please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. And if you have any questions or comments as we're going along, please feel free to put those in the Q&A, and I will stop occasionally and take a look at those. So first, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about our organization. So we are North Carolina Stop Human Trafficking. We were founded in 2010, and our vision is a state free of human trafficking. Our mission is creating communities actively working to abolish human trafficking. And when we say, say the word community, we mean that in a very large sense. The community of, the education community, the faith community, the law enforcement community, not limiting it to just a geographical location. We go about that in several different ways. The first is what we're doing here today, education. So we very much enjoy working with professionals who might encounter victims of human trafficking in their work, and working to educate service providers and others to provide the very best training to others and service to potential victims. We also do general awareness training, which is more for the community and not specific to a profession. I think all of us can understand that human trafficking is a huge issue that no one agency or organization could address by itself. So collaboration is key. So to that end, here in our own local community, we have created a group called the Pitt County Coalition Against Human Trafficking, where we bring in lots of community partners such as law enforcement, the school system, the local domestic violence agency, the Child Advocacy Center, and other nonprofits and agencies who work with vulnerable people. We get together once a month, we do training, we do networking, and make sure that none of our victims and survivors fall through the cracks here in our area. Another collaboration that we're very interested in, and we actually helped create, is the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we proceed. Another thing that we're very interested in is legislation. So here in North Carolina, we do have statutes that are specific to human trafficking. And when you compare them to the rest of the country, they're about average. There are some things that we would like to see improved here on a state level as well as a federal level. And so we work on that. And if there are those of you who are interested in policy and legislation, I invite you to email me and join us in that work. The final thing you see up here is fair trading. And hopefully many of you are familiar with the subject of fair trade and fair trade certification. Basically what it means is that a product that is fair trade certified was not harvested or made or created by an exploited person. It means the person was paid a fair living wage for whatever country they're in. I do want to encourage you to take care of yourself. One of the things we're going to be talking about today is trauma. And so if you find yourself uncomfortable or anxious about anything as we're going through this webinar, I hope that you will take a break and come back when you feel like you're ready. So the things that we are going to talk about today are human trafficking prevention. We're going to discuss supply and demand reduction, in particular for both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We're going to talk about trauma and human trafficking, and then we're going to talk about joining the movement to end human trafficking, and I'm going to give you several different suggestions for how you can do that. So before we move into our first topic, I see that I already have some questions, so let me take a look there. All right, so those were that was actually in the chat box. So we will proceed and we will look at human trafficking first. And the first thing that I need you to understand is that human trafficking is a business. We wouldn't have human trafficking if people weren't making money from it. That's the only motivation for doing it, is profit. So we have to understand that supply and demand is what's driving human trafficking. And supply is always going to equal demand. Just another graphic of that. Supply equals demand. And so what this means is that whatever the demand is, there's going to be someone who is going to be willing to provide the supply or the product in order to make a profit. So in this graphic, we've added another element, not just supply and demand, but also the supplier, which in the business of human trafficking, of course, is the trafficker. So I hope that this kind of helps you understand a little bit. When we look at supply, we're talking about our victims. When we look at demand, we're talking about a sex buyer, if we're talking about sex trafficking, or we're talking about a person or an organization that is buying products, manufactured products by labor. And then, of course, the supplier is either a trafficker, it could be a retailer, if they're reselling products that were made by exploited people. So when we're looking at the supply side and we're talking about prevention, then what that looks like is reducing vulnerabilities in at-risk populations, right? We look at developing protective factors so that people won't fall prey to traffickers. And so we've been doing this for a long time. And if you think about it, really, that's been the main focus of the anti-human trafficking movement since it really began in 2000 when the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed. We've been looking almost exclusively at the supply side. We've been looking at encouraging mentors and adults to engage with potential victims, building resilience, helping them with good decision making, economic stability, healthcare, mental health care, all these things that prevent someone from being trafficked. And all of this is incredibly important. But when we limit ourselves to only looking at the supply side, we're missing out fully half that equation, which is the demand. So as we go through, we're going to talk about the supply side, but mainly focus on the demand side and how to reduce it. So first, we're going to look at labor trafficking. What does supply look like when we're talking about labor trafficking? So it's the people who are being exploited, the people performing labor who are not being paid fairly. And so some examples of that are given here. The apparel industry is notorious for that. I'm sure you've heard the term sweatshops before. There have been some really high profile incidences where people were working in these sewing factories and horrible accidents happened and fatalities occur. So that industry is notorious. Then we look at agriculture, which is another one where we know that labor is being exploited, even here in North Carolina. There have been several cases where hair salons, particularly your African braiding salons, have been found to be exploiting people. And then the seafood industry as well. It has a record of exploitation. What I'd like to do now is share with you, I'd like you to meet someone who is a survivor of labor trafficking, and I'm going to allow him to tell his own story.
Yo fui contratado por una persona en Florida y así como yo viajé a Norte Carolina.
So these farm workers were in their community in Fort Pierce, Florida, as the Florida agricultural season was wrapping up, and they were responded to an ad that they saw recruiting migrant farm workers for work in North Carolina. When they called, they were put in touch with the Baltazar family. The Baltazar family promised these farm workers, including our two clients, that they would have immediate work, ample job hours offered in cucumbers and tobacco. They would be provided housing free of charge with a labor camp kitchen where they could prepare and cook their own meals, and that they would be providing transportation to the job from Fort Pierce, Florida to North Carolina free of charge. And it sounded like an attractive offer to our clients, and so they accepted.
Y todo venía pagado. Nosotros no tuvimos que pagar nada. Sí. Cuando los fuimos contratados, dijeron que teníamos cocina. Pero ya cuando estábamos en el campamento, dijeron que nadie podía meter en la cocina, nadie podía usar. Venimos al campamento y éramos 35 personas y dijo que nadie tenía el derecho de salir, de irse, y que teníamos una deuda de $200 por persona de raite de Florida a Norte Carolina, y que teníamos que pagar $9 de comida por cada tiempo de comida. Era un total de $18 diario de comida.
The meals that they were provided were not enough to sustain our clients, two adult men at that time. And so what they were doing also to supplement their meals was fishing in like a swamp that was behind the labor camp. And then they made a makeshift outdoor kitchen where they would cook this fish from the swamp nearby to supplement their meals. Their contractors, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., would be around the camp or in the fields, always armed. And he subjected them to armed bed checks when some workers tried to leave. The labor camp was set pretty far back from the public road. So you had to kind of drive through a little gate and then up a very long, sandy dirt path to get to the labor camp. And the worker barracks were in the back of the camp. And between the worker barracks and the road to get to the public road was where the traffickers, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., stayed. And so they stayed there so they could watch and make sure that the workers weren't trying to escape without paying this surprise transportation debt and their meal fees. So the workers that were housed in the camp were frustrated and concerned. They were now told that they could not leave without repaying a debt. They had, for this transportation fee, they had no way to repay the debt because there really wasn't that much work that was being provided to them. And they had mounting debt every day because they were locked out of the labor camp kitchen and had to pay their contractors for meals. And so you've got this pressure of this debt you now have to pay, and then mounting debt. You're thinking when the season really starts and there's a significant number of hours for me to work, all of my salary is then going to go to this debt, and I'm still going to be left with nothing. Some of the workers escaped, and there were several waves of workers escaping. And after workers escaped the first time, their contractors, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., rounded them up and, brandishing weapons and telling them that they were not allowed to leave without repaying their debts. And if they tried to leave, then they had bullets in their guns for them. Another group of workers left in the middle of the night, and I think they left in the middle of the night to prevent detection by the crew leaders, including Junior Baltazar. And when that happened, our clients, including Mr. Rivas, heard the gunshots and assumed that those workers were being shot at. And then Junior Baltazar entered the room, flipped the lights on in the middle of the night, holding a weapon, and had them counting off to see who was left in the camp. And this was very powerful and kept these workers, including our two clients, in that situation and made them think that they could not leave. They tricked them into sort of leaving the comfort of the community where they knew how to access things, and into taking this leap of faith and coming to work for them, in a different state, which happened to be North Carolina, to force them to work. We don't typically see force, fraud, and coercion in all of our trafficking cases. But this case certainly was an example where they employed all of those means to keep someone in the situation and with the intention of forcing them to work. We did ultimately, represented those workers to achieve a settlement with the migrant housing provider. And in that settlement, one of the provisions was that if they were going to be operating the camp for a certain period of time in the future, they had to install landline telephone in the worker barracks with a human trafficking poster that had information about human trafficking and the Polaris hotline number. Our clients had the benefit of working with some really amazing case managers. This was when we were just really at the cusp of forging relationships with professionals and other disciplines to serve human trafficking survivors. And so we were able to refer Mr. Rivas to a case manager in another state who helped him to stabilize. He's now been reunited with his family in a safe place, and has, through the help of the case manager and through his own power and drive, has been able to move on from this trafficking situation.
Que la gente es para trabajar, no es para que abusen de ellos, para que no es que lo traten mal, que la gente sea libre, que no sea esclavizada, porque nosotros emigrantes venimos a trabajar duro, pero no nos gusta que los traten mal. Eso nomás quiero decirle a las personas que contratan gente, que tengan un poco de compasión con nosotros.
So I hope you find that personal story as powerful as I do. That there are people like Mr. Rivas who are right here in North Carolina who are being mistreated in our agricultural industry, as well as in other industries, of course. So what does demand look like when we talk about labor trafficking? So there's actually a lot of different layers of demand. We can look at consumers, of course, being the final layer of demand, where there are those of us who love our coffee and want it to be what we consider to be a reasonable price. When we're looking at our produce and other groceries, we want the lowest price possible. Same with our clothes and with our chocolate. And because we expect lower prices, then the retailers and wholesalers have to kind of go down their supply chain and make demands of the workers, not usually the workers themselves, but the contractors. So the different layers of that supply chain. So what are some of the things that are driving demand in labor trafficking? We think we need lots of stuff, right? We deserve a good price. We love a good deal. In some cases, we think we can't afford to pay more. So that's from the consumer perspective. And then, of course, from the perspective of the wholesalers and retailers, their driving force is the profit. And so they are going to try to pay as little as possible for any product and for any labor that's performed. And so when that's your main goal, then that very often is going to result in people accepting jobs or being forced to work in jobs where they're not being paid fairly or treated fairly. So just some other items that consumers are looking for: cheap electronics, the chocolate and coffee, and apparel that we already mentioned. So I wanted to give sort of a specific example, and we're looking here at televisions. Now, I don't know, obviously, what age range of folks are with me here today, but I will tell you that I remember as a child that televisions were something that were expensive. They were, a luxury item that you expected to pay a significant portion of your income to receive one. Now you're looking at the website of Walmart showing the prices of these televisions, and you see how very inexpensive they are, right? $108 being the least of these. And I want you to just think with me for a moment about all the different components that go into manufacturing a television, and the fact that there are none made here in the US. So most of these are made in China or other Asian countries. How, I just can't even wrap my brain around, how could you assemble all these parts and have someone assemble them into a television and then ship it from this Asian country to the United States for $108? That somewhere in that supply chain, somebody is not getting paid or not getting paid fairly. I mean, that is, when you really think about all that goes into, making a television, that is unbelievable that it would only be $108. So I want to look for a moment at Walmart, and I know probably many of you are big Walmart fans, and I'm not picking on them for no reason. I am using them as an example because they are the largest retailer in the world. According to the National Retail Federation, $150 billion in sales in 2020. So what that means is, and notice that I said largest retailer in the world, right? Not the US, the world. So what that means is that Walmart, if they were to make a change in their supply chain policy, to make a change in their way of dealing with their suppliers, with their vendors, that effect would just ripple throughout the global economy. They're that big that if they decided, we're not going to require our vendors and suppliers to shave off every single bit of their profit, the part of their profit that expenses that goes to labor, in order to give us a better price so that we can give folks in the US and other places a better price. If instead they wanted to ensure that their employees, Walmart's employees, as well as the employees of every single one of their suppliers, made a living wage, that would be amazing. Like I said, that would have an impact on the global economy. And that's not where we are now. Neither Walmart nor any of our multinational corporations have that as part of their philosophy, that they want everyone that works for them, either directly or indirectly, to be paid a fair living wage. you probably have seen T-shirts or other things that have the slogan, "People, not profit." And that's what we as a society are going to have to, change people and businesses' mindsets if we want to change how labor trafficking is looked at. So what are some ways that we could help reduce demand for labor trafficking? We could reduce our consumption in general, reduce materialism, because we know we sure are part of a consumption culture, right? We can reuse products. So one way to do that is to patronize thrift shops. We can repair items instead of replacing them. We can just generally reduce the glorification of more and more and more stuff. We can buy fair trade certified products, which we will talk more about in a couple of minutes. We can buy locally made or locally harvested products whenever possible. And of course, we could increase the penalty for labor exploitation. For those of you that are here in North Carolina is a very employer-friendly state. And what that means is that our laws favor employers very strongly as opposed to having more rights for laborers or employees. Employers are rarely investigated for wrongdoing when it comes to treatment of their employees. And if they are, criminal charges are almost never brought. So there needs to be a push from the public to say this is important to us. So I wanted to share with you part of legislation from another state, which is California, that actually passed a statute, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. So this requires large corporations to actually publicize their supply chain so that people can look at it and decide which companies they want to support or not. So you can see here, they are to evaluate and address the risk of human trafficking in their supply chains. They are to audit their suppliers, to be sure that the next one, to be sure to certify that the materials that are incorporated into their product is also free from exploitation. And the last thing here, to be sure that their employees receive training on this issue. I would love to see North Carolina and other states to pass legislation like this, to have our businesses looking more at their supply chain and taking responsibility, being held accountable for the producers that they are purchasing products from. So we do have a federal law as well that was passed in 2015, as you can see here. It prohibits all products that were mined, produced, or manufactured by forced labor, including child labor, from being imported into the United States. That sounds really good. Unfortunately, it's just about impossible to enforce unless we have intelligence or information from the country from which it's being shipped. Obviously, once it gets to our border, it is usually too late to then begin investigating. But if there is information from the country that it's shipped from, then once it gets to our border, then it can be stopped. And there certainly have been cases where ships have been stopped and not allowed to bring their cargo aboard because of an ongoing investigation. So it takes all of us to reduce demand for labor trafficking. It takes consumers, it takes the government, it takes nonprofits, and it takes the business community. But if we can all do our part and work together, then we can reduce demand and hopefully end demand for labor trafficking. So I told you that we were going to talk about fair trade certification a little bit more. Here are the different logos that you can look for when you're shopping. And there's actually criteria that businesses have to meet in order to have their products use this label. And we're just going to go over a couple of them. There are 10 core practices, but we're just going to look at a couple. Fairness in, fair trade practices. You see here highlighted, does not maximize profit at the producer's expense. So it ensures that the producers are treated with respect and come first, not profit. The second one that we're going to highlight is a living wage, that people will be paid at least a wage that they can live on in the local economy. That in and of itself is human trafficking prevention. Because if a person is making a living wage, then they aren't as vulnerable to promises made by a potential trafficker. It also means that women are less likely to be sold into commercial sex or coerced into commercial sex because they're able to make a fair living wage at a legitimate job. One criteria for being fair trade certified is that no children are involved in the production of the product and that there's no discrimination in hiring. And again, when there's not discrimination, that means that women are able to have jobs that pay a living wage and makes them less likely to be vulnerable to sex trafficking. And the final one that we're going to mention today is that fair trade certified products have to have been produced with respect for the environment. They have to maximize the use of raw materials that were sustainably managed. And you'll find if you begin to look for fair trade arts and crafts at places like 10,000 Villages or places like our online store, which is the Fair Traders Project at fairtradersproject.org, you'll see that a lot of them are made from recycled products, recycled paper, or sustainable materials. Like I mentioned, we sell a line of purses that is made primarily from native grasses in Cambodia. So it's amazing how creative people get when they're trying to make a product that they can sell that's not harmful to the environment and not harmful to the people that are making it, that are actually creating good jobs for them. So one of the things that we do at least once a year is have a webinar that gives you a lot more information about fair trade. Fair Trade Month is October. So keep your eyes open, and we'll be publicizing this webinar in the coming months. And if you would like to learn more about fair trade and human trafficking, you can go to our YouTube channel and you can see the recording from last year, or you can wait until this year. So I'm going to stop for just a moment and see if we have any questions or comments before we move on to our next topic. Tina asked if the slides will be available later. So yes, Tina, what we're going to do is within the next day or two, I'm going to send you a follow-up email, and it will have a recording and the slides as well. And it'll have information about how to register for our upcoming webinars. So yes. And I see someone's commenting that Angela's commenting that she recently discovered several fair trade products being sold at her local Aldi's. And I'll tell y'all, I mean, I shop at Food Line and they have fair trade products. I go to Publix sometimes, Fresh Market, they definitely do. So, you know, probably the grocery store that you're shopping at does have it. You just have to start looking for those logos and being aware of it. And the products that you are most likely to find fair trade certified options are coffee, tea, chocolate, and sugar. There are others, cereal sometimes. I have seen in our Food Lion this product that is very much like Pop-Tarts. It's not name brand Pop-Tarts, but it's that type of a product, and it's fair trade certified. So olive oil. So you just have to be on the lookout. Or like I mentioned, go to specific stores. 10,000 Villages is certainly one. Our nonprofit, as I mentioned, has its own nonprofit, its own fair trade branch. So you just have to kind of look for that kind of thing. So we're going to switch now, and we are going to talk about sex trafficking, supply and demand. So what does supply look like when we're talking about sex trafficking? And of course, what it looks like is what we would refer to as victims, or if they're able to come out of that situation, survivors. And so all of these are some pictures of some fairly high profile survivors that were involved in court cases or that kind of thing. So if supply looks like the victims, what does demand look like? Demand looks like the buyers. And so there was a fairly detailed study done by a group called Demand Abolition called Who Buys Sex? And so we're going to look at a little bit of information from that study. The good news is that 80% of men never buy sex, ever. 80%. So the vast majority never buy sex. So 20% buy sex at some time in their lifetime. 6% of men have bought sex within the last year. And then a small percentage of that 6% are actually what we call high frequency buyers. So when we look at people who are engaged in buying sex, it's really a very small percentage of people. And of course, you have noticed that I've just been referring to men. It's almost exclusively men, whether the victims are male or female. The buyers are almost always men. There's a very small percentage of women who buy sex. So what we need to figure out is, how do we address in an effective way, how can we talk to these buyers, whether they're the ones who are high frequency buyers, which actually make up 75% of the market, as hard as that is to believe. They're a tiny percentage of people, but they're doing enough buying to be 75% of the market. Or if they're the more occasional, recreational, you know, I did it on my birthday, it's a bachelor party weekend, that kind of thing. So we have to look at different ways to address different types of buyers. So if we're looking at someone who's a compulsive buyer, then simply educating them that, hey, it's bad for you, or it's bad for the person you're buying, that's not going to be enough to stop a compulsive buyer. Probably what they're going to need, if they are willing, is some type of treatment. Now, for the other ones who just do it occasionally or just did it once, to prevent them from doing it again, may simply require education, letting them, helping them understand that the people that they're buying are not there voluntarily, and kind of helping them build some empathy for the people that are being bought. That may be enough for them. So there's different strategies for dealing with different types of buyers. So I know this is probably too small for you to get a lot from, but the main thing I wanted you to see is that when you're look at the far right at people who make 100K or more, and you'll see that they have the highest percentage of active high frequency buyers. Which shouldn't come as any big surprise, right? People with more money have more disposable income to spend on something like buying sex. But that is just kind of an interesting fact that we can pull out of there, is that many of our high frequency buyers make over 100K. So
My name is John.
So now I'm going to introduce you to someone who is a former sex buyer, because we can learn a lot from someone who's bought sex in the past, just like we can learn a lot about victimization from someone who has been a victim. So this is John Pulley.
My name is John Pulley, and I'm a registered sex offender. I was arrested for criminal solicitation of a minor when I attempted to meet with someone that I had met in a teen chat room online whose profile said they were 15 years old. I went through 10 years of probation and treatment in the state of Texas. And if you looked at my life before my arrest, you'd see somebody that was pretty successful, at least on the outside. My sales career had taken off. I was making, I think the year before I had made $130,000 a year. I was married to a woman who was an attorney and on the fast track to making partner at a law firm in downtown Dallas. She and I owned a home in the northern suburbs of Dallas. We had investment properties. We took vacations. We had friends. And so our lives on the outside, at least, looked good. Now, when I said that I had a 10-year porn addiction and a 3-year sex addiction, what's important about my story is that I also had a lifetime behind that of being told that I wasn't good enough, and insecurity and shame and condemnation for not being good enough. And that drove me in a lot of things in my life. I'm not unusual in that usually the things in our childhood that we're taught or the things that we believe about ourselves carry on with us into adulthood. And so for me, I had turned to pornography as my outlet for stress. And that led me over time, again, a 10-year period, to reach a point where I would actually go after someone that's a teenager online. I tell you that because my story was there before the crime happened. And in our society, I watched people go through so much. I watched them get divorces like I did. I sold marching bands to high schools and colleges, marching band uniforms to high schools and colleges, and lost my job instantly. I watched people not be able to see their children. They couldn't go to their children's sporting events or their school events. I saw family members turn on people and watch people that yes, there are consequences. And by the way, I'm not saying there shouldn't be. There should be consequences for breaking the law. There should be consequences. But when I look at men like myself who lost everything and was really trying to do a good job, I was just put down at every turn. I couldn't get a job because I had a felony. I couldn't find a place to live a lot of times because I had a felony. There was just so many things and challenges. And behind the crime and the label are people. They're human beings that have somehow or another gotten off the path, because no one is born into saying, hey, I'm going to go after a teenager or I'm going to commit a sexual assault. That's just not what happens. Something happens along the way that gets them there. Now, a lot of people will take they'll get somebody that gets arrested for a crime, convicted, put them through a one-day school and say, hey, we've told them these are the dangers, this is what's going on. And so we end up with people that go into this and say, oh, I've done a school, but that doesn't fix things. You can't take a lifetime of choices and issues and fix them in a day. Fortunately for me, I was in the state of Texas where I got arrested, and they had a program that's one like the one that's being presented to you today, where they take people through and they dive in The sex offenders have to pay for it, but they dive in to the issues that brought them where they were, why they make choices. And we learn things like thinking errors. How do we use redirection to get the focus off of us? Blaming, a victim blaming. There's 1,000 thinking errors we use. And what happened over the course of time was I learned how to build a skill set that would allow me to step back into society and be valuable. So I hope that you will consider doing this program that is being presented to you because, yeah, I said at the beginning, my name is John Pulley and I'm a registered sex offender. I'm also the demand reduction consultant to Fierce Freedom in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which is an anti-human trafficking organization. I also had the opportunity to share my story across the country, and I've been able to speak with some of the top law enforcement influencers. I've been able to speak on stage with the founder of the National Johns Initiative that has arrested over 10,000 men that did a crime just like what I did. Because if we take people and want to have an impact on our society to change human trafficking, we're going to have to change the attitudes behind what got us there. Because demand is the problem. The brokenness is the problem. And if we can find a way to implement a program like this one that will allow somebody the chance to start over, you get somebody that can turn around and make an impact on society for this generation and for generations to come.
So John talked about, he referred, to an all-day session. And what he was referring to is something that's called a John School, which is not a term that any of us in this movement like, but that's what it's been called. That does what I mentioned earlier, which educates people, primarily people who've been arrested. So it's someone, often what happens is someone who's arrested for the first time for buying sex will be offered the opportunity to go to a John School and have that charge dismissed if they complete it. And John Schools look different in a lot of different places. In one place I'm aware of, it's showing them a 15-minute video. In other places, it's more in depth where you actually hear from a survivor of human trafficking. You hear about, from a mental health professional, a healthcare professional, public healthcare, and get a lot more information about it. But he's right, as I mentioned previously, for a lot of people, that's not going to be enough. They're going to need a more intensive treatment like he went through and feels like he benefited from. So what we want to discuss now is what is fueling this demand. Even John said demand is what's causing the problem here. What's fueling the demand? And part of that is the objectification of human beings. When we think of people as being objects, then of course it makes sense that you would buy them because we can buy objects. And so this sense that objectification is okay, we see a lot in advertisements, in media, in music. So we're going to look at a couple of examples of that. So here are some examples of lyrics and music that objectify people. And here's more. And of course, we could go on and on and on with this in music. It's very common, as you well know. Here's some in advertising. And you probably saw these when they were airing. And if you were like me, you wondered what in the world they were selling because it sure wasn't hamburgers. Here's some others that are using, or objectifying the human beings in the ad in order to sell a product. And of course, the objectification that we see in our society through media has led to an acceptance of pornography. And many will use the term, the pornification of our society, where people accept it and think it's just something that everyone does. is to consume pornography. Pornography is very closely related to sex trafficking. A couple of quotes here from some research we've done. Frequent sex buyers use pornography much more often than people who don't buy sex. In fact, men who go to prostitutes are twice as likely to have watched a porn film in the last year compared to the general population. Pornography makes prostitution and sexually exploiting others look normal. There's a strong association between pornography use and going to prostitutes. And so if this is something that you're intrigued by, this idea of the relationship between pornography and sex trafficking, I'm going to be conducting a webinar on this in a couple of weeks and would love to have you join me for that. But for the moment, I'll just say there is a direct link between consuming pornography and then purchasing sex. There is a link. So what needs to happen? We need to have a full out culture shift from this idea that people are products to be used, and have a complete shift and turn around to understand that people are individuals to be respected and loved. So some things that we can do to move towards this idea of reducing demand for sex trafficking is to reduce porn consumption, to hold the sex buyers accountable instead of prosecuting the victims, and to increase the penalty for buying sex, as I mentioned earlier. So there is a movement in our state in North Carolina to figure out how can we as a state work to reduce demand. And here are some of the elements of the plan, creating more awareness and education and collaboration around the issue of demand reduction, policy changes, engaging law enforcement, and looking at options like we just mentioned, diversion. The John School is considered a diversion strategy, and the treatment options for those who purchase sex. Some additional things on here: cyber patrols, which are people who are, so an organization will post a fake ad for sex trafficking, and when someone responds to that ad, they will talk to that person about their consumption of sex. So something similar to that is the next one over, which is using technology. Is similar, but instead of a person actually answering the phone and talking to them, it would be a bot, or they would be referred to a web page that would have information. We've already talked about John School, and then public education is something that we're interested in too, is having demand reduction to be included as a part of sex ed. So who is the group doing all this work? It's a group called the Demand Reduction Task Force, and our nonprofit NC Stop Human Trafficking was one of 3 that started it 2 years ago. And we would love for you to learn more about it and to become a part of it. You can just go to this website and see all the different teams that we have listed that are working on the issue. And we would love for you to be a part of a team. And there's a way you can email me for more information, and there's a way for you to email from the website as well. So we are going to have a major shift in gears, moving from this idea of demand reduction, supply and demand, that kind of thing, and move into the topic of trauma. So let me check for questions or comments. And someone mentioned Ben and Jerry's. It's calorie free when it's fair trade ice cream, y'all. In case you didn't know. All right, we are going to shift and talk about trauma and human trafficking. So in many cases, this is a sort of a which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing, because someone who has who has been a victim of trauma is more vulnerable to being trafficked, but also someone who has been trafficked, that is a form of trauma. And so you're also more likely to suffer through additional traumas, as we know that cycle, once you've been a victim. So it's, again, two things that are very, very closely related. So just in case we have folks in here who don't understand what trauma is, we're going to go through the difference between trauma and complex trauma. So trauma is an intense psychological response to a stressful situation. It causes lasting effects on a person, and it impacts our functioning because stressful stimuli overwhelm the person's ability to cope. Now, one thing I want to mention right off the bat is that trauma affects people differently. So it's not a one size fits all. So I'm going to give you an example. Say me and my colleague Melinda are in a car accident together, and we both have some minor injuries, physical injuries. We both recover from those, and Melinda's fine, and she goes on like normal, driving a car and living her life normally. But me, I was in the same car accident. I had similar injuries, which have healed, but now I refuse to get in a car, or I refuse to drive because I'm so traumatized by this car accident we were in. So trauma affects people differently. Now, complex trauma is basically what we just talked about, but over and over and over. It's traumatic events that occur, the result of traumatic events that occur repeatedly over a prolonged period of time, of an interpersonal nature. So it's very often someone or someone, even a relative, that is causing the trauma to you. And it's during important developmental stages or in instances of disability, disempowerment, or dependency. So if you have a trauma that happens to a child, of course, it's always going to be during an important developmental stage. I would submit that if it happens to anyone, say 25 or younger, because what we know now, of course, is that our brains don't fully mature until about our mid-20s. So we're still in important developmental stages, right, until our brain fully matures. The other thing that I'll add to this slide is that a piece of complex trauma is that you can't see a way out. You don't see an end in sight. So whereas trauma, the previous slide, this can be a car accident. It happens and it's over. Someone breaks into your house, it happens and it's over. Even something as horrible as a sexual assault, it happens once and it's over. Whereas complex trauma is happening over and over again. So it could be domestic violence. It could be sexual assault that's happening within a relationship, or childhood sexual abuse, that's happening over and over and over a long period of time. So want to be sure that we're clear on the difference between, quote, regular trauma and complex trauma. So human trafficking is almost always going to be a complex trauma, unless the person is lucky enough to get out of that situation very early. Normally, it happens. The commercial sex happens over and over and over a long period of time, or in a case of labor trafficking, like Mr. Rivas shared, his ordeal was something that happened over a period of several months. So I will bet that a lot of you are familiar with the ACE survey, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. And that is, basically these adverse childhood experiences are traumas that happen to us during our childhood. And for many people, unfortunately, that's where their trauma starts, is as a child. And if they're starting from the beginning with these bad experiences, then that does make them more vulnerable to trafficking as well as other bad outcomes. if you are interested in learning more, I mean, there was a study that was done that showed that children who had high scores on this ACE survey were more likely to have a variety of health issues as adults. And not things that you would necessarily expect. I mean, health related things like heart problems and higher incidences of cancer and asthma. So this idea that what's going on and how our mental health is, and that it's very much affects our physical health is really shown in detail by this particular survey. If you're interested in learning more about it, I encourage you to check out this documentary called Resilience that goes into detail about the ACE survey. Its idea, this documentary, is that well, the quote from the famous quote from it is, if it's predictable, it's preventable. So if we know that going through these adverse childhood experiences has these bad outcomes, then what we can do is prevent that. And we can build resilience in these kids. And so that's what this documentary is about. So strongly recommend you to take a look at that. So here are the adverse childhood experiences. And I think you can look at these and agree that they are adverse childhood experiences. And you'll also probably look at it and go, well, you know, I can think of several that aren't on here. And that certainly is true. But these are the 10 that they used as a baseline for their survey. So one of them, of course, is childhood sexual abuse that you see on here. So I want to talk about that for a moment. When we look at women and girls who are being prostituted, up to 84% of them are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. That's a pretty amazing statistic if you just sit with that for a moment, that of people who are being prostituted as adults, that over 80% of them were survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Then that tells us if we're wanting to prevent sex trafficking, we've got to go way upstream, right? We've got to address the issue of childhood sexual abuse. And that's something I would encourage you to do. I encourage you to investigate another training that's by a group called Stewards of Children. Just Google that and you should come across their 2-hour training on childhood sexual abuse prevention and identification. So we know that victims of sex trafficking have histories of sexual abuse. Does it surprise you to know that traffickers have experienced childhood sexual abuse as well? And so what we need to understand is that when a child experiences these horrible ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that it creates not only vulnerability to being a victim in the future, but also vulnerability to being a perpetrator in the future, so that we really, really have motivation to go back and to try to do some prevention work. As I mentioned, there are several other traumatic experiences that do intersect with human trafficking. One of those is either being a part of a gang or being actively recruited to be a part of a gang. We know that gangs will promise to take care of them and be their family. And then sadly, you know, for females, they will very often require them to sell sex and say that the money made is their contribution to the gang. For the males, you know, they may be the ones that are being required to be the recruiters of the victims, to be the so-called pimps, or to be involved with drug sales. Homelessness is a big vulnerability when it comes to trafficking. And we see here that almost 20% of homeless youth that were interviewed in this particular study were identified as victims of some form of trafficking. So what we need to do is do whatever we can to prevent minors from becoming homeless. We know that being in foster care or involved with child protective services is certainly an adverse childhood experience, because you don't get in foster care unless something pretty bad has happened in your family, right? And unfortunately, we know that traffickers will intentionally seek out and prey on kids who are in foster care. So a few other factors that contribute to trauma: poverty, family dysfunction, isolation, unaccompanied foreign nationals who are minors in particular, being involved in the juvenile justice system, and feelings of rejection or marginalization. So if we think about all these different types of trauma, those that are included in the ACE survey and those that are not, what can we do to help these kids? And so what we know is that if a child who has encountered these types of traumas is identified early and receives counseling and assistance with building resilience and tools for building resilience, their chances of being victimized again decreases. So screening and early treatment of trauma are human trafficking prevention strategies. And this is being done in some pediatric offices. And we think that is just a terrific idea, to screen for trauma and help the parents help build resilience in the child. The other thing that we know is really, really helpful in building resilience is having that one adult who is concerned and who cares about the child and is building relationship. And that doesn't have to be a parent. And sadly, very often the parents are the ones that are causing the trauma. But it could be a coach, it could be a neighbor, it could be a friend's parent, someone at church, a teacher, but just one person who will take an interest in this child who seems vulnerable or at risk or has already been through a trauma, and show concern, develop a connection. That one adult can prevent just a myriad of poor outcomes. Sadly, we really can't address this issue of sex trafficking and trauma and complex trauma without mentioning the concept of familial child sex trafficking. We don't want to believe that parents and families would be the people who are exploiting children for sex, but the more that we hear from adult victims of sex trafficking, the more we learn that it's a higher percentage of the victims than we previously thought. So the very people who are supposed to be protecting and taking care of children are sometimes the very ones who are exploiting them. So next, I'm going to introduce you to my friend Vicki, who is a survivor of familial child sex trafficking. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you it's a hard story. So encourage you to take care of yourself. If you hear something that makes you uncomfortable and you need to take a break, please do that.
I was raised by an old North Carolina family. We went to church every Sunday. We lived in an upper middle class neighborhood in Raleigh. Presented a good front. They went to all the PTO meetings. They went to all the church meetings. I was 3 when he brought my cat. My sister and I each had a cat. And he brought my cat into the garage and said, "This is what will happen to you if you ever tell the things that are happening to you." At the time, he initiated the digital touching, digital abuse. It had slit its neck and it was dripping blood and dead. And he said, that's what will happen to you if you tell. In Hawaii is when the exploitation started. It was a group that met at the ocean's front in a pineapple field. So you would go through all the dirt roads and everything of the pineapple field, and you would get to the ocean part. And it was a group of people that met, men and women. They started out scaring the kids, because as we drove down the road, they would had on Halloween costumes, scary ones, and they would be putting their faces in the windows and making scary sounds and kind of terrifying the kids. And so at that group meeting, which was pretty large, there were probably 30 to 40 people there, I was initiated into the things that were expected of me sexually, one of which was oral sex. And I bit his penis, and he jerked me up by the neck and started dunking me in the water. And I once again learned that they were the ones in control, not me. My father would announce at the dinner table that he was taking Vicky to a party. My mother took me in the bedroom and was getting me dressed to go, and she was putting on a sweater. And I said, please don't make me go. You don't know what they do there. Please don't make me go. And it's a very small house. He walked in, he heard, told me to get in the car. I got in the car. We drove there in stone silence. We got to the barn, and he went in and told the head guy. The head guy came up and shrieked in my ear, you told. And then they hung me from a 2-story barn by my shoulders. Well, the ropes went under here, and they left me there most of the night. The next morning, my father came and took me down. He seemed to have one rule, which is I can't kill him off. Virginia might have a hard time with that, and her family was influential. So he came and cut me off. He took me back home to my mother. I couldn't lift my arms to eat. My mother had to spoon feed me for like 2 days, and she never asked what happened. And I feel like she felt like she'd gotten in over her head and had no clue how to handle it. And the easiest way to handle it was to sacrifice her oldest child so she could protect the 3 younger ones, which is what I feel like she must have been thinking. We moved back to Raleigh. We moved to the neighborhood of Beck-Anna, which probably still is upper middle class. I went to junior high, and the principal was a pedophile, and he would have sexual encounters with me, as well as a couple of other kids that were at the school. There was also a club that had my father in it, my uncle in it, who was an abuser, a bunch of other men who were abusers. They had regular meetings, a lot of which happened down at the State Theater that was down on State Street in Raleigh. And my father got me a job at age 16 working at the State Theater. But after that, the nighttime, they would show porn films, and they would use us kids to service the people sitting there looking at the porn films. With the familial child, because they live in the home, it's really, really difficult to figure it out. It's been difficult. I didn't come out of this unscathed. I didn't come out of this perfectly whole, not like a child who was raised in a loving, righteous family. I came out of this as a traumatized child who has severe fear of abandonment. I have fear of everything. My life is basically good. I have a great family. They're not perfect. They all have different issues, but they're still a great family.
So that is Vicky's story. And I wanted to point out, usually, if we're in person, I would ask for more discussion, but I'm sure that you noticed there were a couple of times as Vicki was telling her story that she laughed and, in inappropriate places. And of course, that's, just a part of that trauma of a coping mechanism to get through telling this really hurtful story. Um, we have two more small clips where she's really going to talk a little bit more about her trauma. That this was kind of a summary of her story, and now she's going to share some about her trauma.
I tend to not know boundaries with people of the opposite sex very well because I was never taught any of them. My husband works on teaching them to me now to make sure that I don't do anything stupid. And it also made me have terrible trust issues. Mostly my problems though are abandonment issues, because when I would be gang raped and then they would take me, like the people that met in the bar, and they would take me and they would toss me in this nasty, dirty corner till the next person decided they wanted to pick me up. And so I have all these abandonment issues, which are difficult. They're difficult on Jody. When he married me, I was in law school, or when he met me, I was in law school studying for women and children's rights. And everybody thought I was like really independent and, this feminist, but really I was not very independent, and I'm very insecure when Jody's not around. And that's been somewhat hard on him because of that, it's just hard on him, but he does pretty good. We've learned different ways of coping through the years, but it's been difficult. I didn't come out of this unscathed. I didn't come out of this perfectly whole, like a child who was raised in a loving, righteous family. I came out of this as a traumatized child who has severe fear of abandonment. I have fear of everything. If I'm up too high, I'm afraid. If I'm down too low, I'm afraid. If I'm too hot, I'm afraid. And it's all the different tortures they did on me. They just kind of bring it up like this. Most of the time, I don't lose it. Most of the time, I can cope with it, but it has to take a lot out of me to be constantly coping with it, constantly trying to stuff this fear down, talk myself, reason with myself. There's no reason to be afraid here. You're safe here, It's a constant thing. I was molested by my father when I was 11. I knew those words. I didn't really know what it meant, but I knew those words, and I had told Jody that. But when our oldest daughter was 11, she looked just exactly like me. And so we would sit down at the family dinner table, and I would be terrified, just absolutely terrified. And if Jody looked at Jennifer, I would flip out, totally flip out. It's just embarrassing to think about how awful I was. And because that was what my father would do. He would look at me and then he would announce I was going. So we decided I needed further therapy. So I started going to more therapy and all of the incest stuff, because there was a lot of incest too. Just abused by my father just in the home. I mean, I was raped almost every night by the man. That started coming forth. And I did what my therapist said, which was to write a letter to my father, my parents. And we composed a letter to him, I remembered this and said this stuff and this and stuff, and I don't want to see you for a while. My mother calls up and says, we're coming up there and we're going to have you committed because this is just totally insane. And so I had Jody to help give me strength. So they didn't come. I didn't do anything about it. And the therapy kept going on. And then I started having the multiple perpetrator, the gang rape therapy. And I was pregnant with Hannah by then, and very pregnant. And I was remembering multiple rapes and gang therapies. And I was remembering the woman that had to kill herself because she was starting to tell, because I was starting to tell Jody and I was starting to tell the therapist. So I would wake up in the middle of the night in the midst of a bad nightmare, feeling like I had to kill myself. I would try and wake up Jody, and he was awful. If you ever think my husband's a hero, remember that he wasn't always great. He was awful. Leave me alone. I'm trying to sleep. And I'm like, I'm freaking out. Luckily, I had a minister that said, you can call me anytime, night or day, and I'll help you work through this stuff. So I would call Scott, and I would go in the kitchen, I would get the knife out, I would start to do what I had been brainwashed to do, and then I would go, there's a baby in there, I can't hurt this baby. And so I would put the knife down and I would go call Scott.
So I put the slide back up again just so we could take a look and see if we thought that what Vicky experienced was complex trauma, traumatic events that occur repeatedly over a prolonged period of time. Yes, of an interpersonal nature. So this was her dad that was doing this to her. And of course, I'm sure y'all noticed, her mom was not, as far as we know, directly involved with the sexual abuse and trafficking, but she was aware that something was going on and did nothing to prevent it. So Vicky didn't have an adult to turn to because both of the people who were supposed to be protecting her weren't. And of course, it was during important developmental stages because she was a child and she was dependent. So the reason that I shared particularly those last two clips with you is just to give you an idea of what it's like to try to recover from this type of trauma. And I actually do a whole class on this, but just wanted in this HT201 to give you a little taste of it, to understand that when our brain goes through and experiences this kind of trauma, it changes our brain and it makes us behave in ways that we wouldn't otherwise behave in. So, the nightmares, the the triggers that she experienced, like just simply sitting at a dinner table with her husband and her child, because her child was at the age where she first remembered being molested, and her child looked like her, and her husband would look at the child like her dad did. So all of that is triggers to the trauma that she was experiencing. If this is something that you would like to learn more about her story specifically, she and her husband actually wrote a book about this, because it was a pretty long journey up with therapy for her to remember. And I'm sure she would say that she hasn't remembered everything. But this book is about what it was like to remember these things that had been suppressed from her childhood, and their journey where they actually went to these different places around the country where it happened, and she could identify landmarks and that kind of thing. It's a fascinating story. We are going to look for a moment at the line that I've already drawn for you, the relationship between child sexual abuse and child sex trafficking. And related to that, of course, is the idea of child sexual abuse images, which is the term now that's being preferred in the field instead of child pornography. In fact, there is actually a bill before Congress now to change all the statutes, all the federal statutes that use the term child pornography, and change it to child sexual abuse images, which I'm in favor of, because I'm in favor of calling things what they are. And letting people remember when we're talking about child porn, or some people call it, heaven forbid, kiddie porn. You know, this isn't some harmless thing we're talking about. What we are talking about is images of children being sexually abused. And we need to remember that. One thing that we do know as well is obviously this child sexual abuse alone is horrible enough, but when there are images, particularly videos taken of that are then made available to other people, that adds another layer of trauma. And there is a documentary called Not Just Pictures that was produced actually here in North Carolina by a giant in the anti-child trafficking field, Dr. Sharon Cooper. And it goes into the trauma that the minors experience, knowing that these pictures or videos of them being abused are still available. There's nothing they could do to get those pictures back. You know, the idea that they're walking down the street and somebody could potentially recognize them from these videos. So it deals with the issue of that type of trauma. And just to keep this real, I wanted to share this story from a couple of years ago. We had a local city commissioner that was arrested on 12 counts of second-degree sexual exploitation of a minor by the SBI. So whenever you see that charge here in North Carolina anyway, second-degree sexual exploitation, generally that is child sexual abuse images. And you can see here that he had videos of kids as young as 2 years old engaged in sex acts. So I share this particular case because I think that sometimes we have an idea in our head of what the bad guys, who they are and what they look like. And, you know, they're these gutter dwellers. And we have to remember they're everybody. They're in positions of leadership. They're members of our church. They are members of our business community. There is not one demographic that exploits children. It's a variety. So I'm going to check before we move on to part 3. I do not know the answer to that question, Angela. All right. Got some good comments in there. So what I'm going to do now is I want you all who are here with me today, if you are not already actively a part of the anti-human trafficking movement, I want to empower you to do that today. So I'm going to give you a lot of different suggestions. They won't all work for you. I hope at least one of them will. And if you have questions about any of these, please send me an email because I would love to get you connected. So the first one that I want to mention is shameless self-support. Our organization is actually a membership organization, and we would love to have you join us. You can join as an individual. If you're part of a nonprofit or an agency, we would love to have that organization join us. And certainly if you own a business or if you think that the business you work for would be willing to be a member, we would love that. So you just go to our website and look to get involved, and it's right under that tab. So because this is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we have a lot of webinars this month, way more than we usually do. So I'm going to flip through these, and you can use the QR code if you like. Also, as I mentioned, in the follow-up email I send, it'll have a link so you can register to these, or you can go to our website and look under get involved. So the first of these that is actually this week, my colleague Melinda is going to lead, and it's talking to kids about boundaries, consent, and porn. And this is really good if you're a parent, grandparent, or someone else who works with young people, helping you talk about some of these hard issues. So this is one of my favorites, I have to admit. I'll be leading this one. It's an overview of the anti-human trafficking movement in North Carolina. Y'all, there have been a lot of changes. I last did this overview last January, and I'm having to update the whole thing just about, because there have been so many changes here in North Carolina in the movement. Changes in the different organizations that are working, obviously changes in the statistics that apply to us here in North Carolina, but invite you to join me. Don't feel like, well, I saw it last year, so I know everything. A lot has changed since then. So I mentioned this already, that I'll be doing this in a couple of weeks, the sex trafficking, what's porn got to do with it. Very, very closely related, and we'll go into detail on that. And then another one from my colleague, Melinda, tips for keeping kids safe online. What we know right now is that predators are out there, and this is the way they are introducing themselves to grooming and recruiting kids for exploitation. It's online. Not to say that it doesn't happen in person, but right now the majority of it is happening online. So if you have kids, grandkids, or other kids that you work with, you I think could greatly benefit from this. Before we go any further, I think I've mentioned a couple of times the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I would love it if you would just stop now and put this number into your phone, so that when you are out and you encounter something that you find suspicious, that you can call right then. If you are someone who is wondering, well, what does she mean? I see something suspicious. I don't know what to be suspicious about. That means you need to go through Human Trafficking 101. We already did that this month, and it is on our YouTube channel. So please check that out if you haven't seen it already. It'll give you the red flags for what to look for. So the easiest thing that you can do is to join the movement is just to talk to people about the issue of human trafficking and help them understand that, yes, it is happening here in the US, in North Carolina, and that no, it almost never involves a van driving through the neighborhood. Okay, it is people that you know, or you think you know, that are recruiting minors and adults into trafficking. So just starting that conversation is a huge help. The second easiest thing you can do is to follow us on social media, especially this month, y'all. We have a ton of information on our social media accounts, and this is an easy way for you to share information with your friends. If you're not comfortable bringing up the topic in conversation, you can share information with them via your social media about human trafficking. So I mentioned earlier that we had started here in Pitt County, the Pitt County Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And if you are local, we would love for you to join us. We are meeting next month here in Greenville, and I'll be glad to send you that address. If you're interested, shoot me an email. If you are thinking about starting such a group in your own area, two things. One, we'd love for you to come and visit ours just to see what one looks like if you'd like to. And two, we would love to help you with that. We started ours back in 2016. So we obviously learned a little bit along the way that we'd love to share with you, so you don't have to learn it yourself. So we'd be glad to help you if you're interested in starting a coalition locally. So I showed you all of these things, all these logos earlier in the presentation, and just invite you to please look for these in your local grocery store. And if you are interested in supporting our nonprofit by buying fair trade products that we sell, you can go to fairtradersproject.org. And we would be grateful for your support in that way. And Fair Traders itself has its own Instagram and Facebook accounts that you can take a look at there as well. Okay, here we go on things that require a little bit more work in terms of getting involved in the movement. Contacting your legislators is so important, y'all. And believe me when I tell you, they want to hear from you. Even here in North Carolina, so many bills get proposed every session that our legislators cannot be educated on every one of them and can't have a position on every one of them. And that's doubly or triply true on the national level. There are just so many bills. There's no way, even with their staff, for them to be able to research every single bill. So what they need to know is what's important to their constituents. And so when a bill comes up about human trafficking, or even if you just want to let them know, if you don't have a specific bill in mind, you want them to know human trafficking is an issue I'm concerned about. And when legislation comes up about it, I want you to take notice. Of course, what we're going to do on our end, we have a legislative agenda. And so we would love for, if you would reach out to me, I would be glad to tell you specific things that you can talk to your legislators about. We will be planning some visits to Raleigh during this session. Certainly writing letters and emails and calls. I mean, they're all important. Visits are the best, but calling is also good. The emails where, this is typically federal legislation where, organizations send it out and you just press a button. They get a lot of those. So more personalized type of contact has a greater impact. Now, how about your local law enforcement? They are a super important part of the fight against human trafficking. Do you know if your local sheriff's department or your local police department has had any training in human trafficking? Do you know what their position is? I interact with sheriffs and police chiefs and officers across the state who look me straight in the eye and tell me that it's not a problem in their area. And you know what? You don't know it's a problem if you're not looking for it. If you don't know what the red flags are, if you don't know how to identify a victim, then of course you're not seeing victims and you think that you don't have it. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I would just invite you to call your local law enforcement and very respectfully ask if they've received training, and then ask how many people have received training. Because a lot of times what they'll do is send one person, and then that one person doesn't necessarily share it with the rest of the group. So it's important to check and see if they have received training. And then another good question to ask is, well, have you charged anyone? Have you helped any victims, or have you charged any sex buyers? Really delve into what their level of involvement is. And again, let them know this is something that you as a citizen are concerned about, and that will help them to be more concerned about it. So we talked about a lot of things today, and a pretty wide variety of things today. Human trafficking prevention, looking at supply and demand reduction for both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We looked at trauma and human trafficking and how they're interrelated. And then we just spent some time looking at different ways to join the movement and to really have an impact on the issue of human trafficking. So I'm going to introduce you here to our team. Myself, whom you've met, Melinda, my colleague, who's going to be presenting a couple of webinars that I mentioned, and Vanessa Berriman, who is our newest team member. She joined us in July, and she is bilingual and is going to start presenting some of our webinars in Spanish. She has already this month done Human Trafficking 101 in Spanish. And again, if you missed that and are interested in it or have some colleagues that might be interested in that, please just check out our YouTube channel and it'll be there. So now is a great time. If you've got questions, if you've got comments about anything that we've talked about today, please put those in the Q&A and we'll try to get those addressed. So Diane is asking about if there are statistics on the percentage of people in porn that are victims of human trafficking. You know, Diane, I don't know if we have actual statistics. We definitely have anecdotal evidence. And yes, I will be sharing some of that during that webinar. We'll have survivors who are going to tell their stories, one in particular from the porn industry. Do we have any other questions or comments? I really appreciate y'all being here with me today. We did finish a little bit early, and so if you do have questions, I am certainly glad to stay here and answer those. If you want to email me separately, that is fine as well. I will be sending you, as I mentioned, I just lost it. Oh. I will be sending you a follow-up email, and you're welcome to respond to that with questions as well. Thank you for the kind words that are in the chat. I really appreciate that. I hope that we will see you on some of our other webinars this month. We appreciate your support. Have a good one.